Good morning. Thanks for joining us for our webinar on strategy and business planning for the progressive farm business. I'm Jim Mintert, Director of the Center for Commercial Agriculture, and joining me are my colleagues Michael Langemeyer, who's a professor in agricultural economics and also Associate Director of the Center for Commercial Agriculture, and my colleague Mike Bolge, who's a professor of agricultural economics and also a member of the Center for Commercial Agriculture faculty. So we're going to spend a little time today talking about revisiting some of the things that we did in the workshop back in February, a little bit of revisiting what we talked about in the month of March on the previous webinar, and then look ahead a little bit to what we're going to do in August at the upcoming workshop. And before I start, I want to mention that I really want to thank First Farm Credit for helping to sponsor these workshops and these webinars. We really appreciate the support of First Farm Credit in helping us develop these programs, deliver them to you. So with that, if you have some questions during the course of the webinar, I'll periodically be checking my email here at Purdue. So the email is jmintert@purdue.edu, and we'll check those periodically. So if you got a question, don't hesitate to pop that in, and we'll be checking those during the course of the webinar. And if for some reason we're not able to address it during the webinar, or if maybe a question comes up shortly after the webinar is over, again, feel free to email that to me, and we'll respond to that either this afternoon or tomorrow. So with that, we're going to kick it off a little bit. And the first thing I want to do is just talk about how much things have changed since the March webinar. And of course, everybody watching this webinar is very aware of the change in corn and soybean prices we've seen since then. We thought we'd take a quick look at the change behind the change in prices. So this is a stocks-to-use ratios chart for both corn and soybeans, not for the U.S., but on a worldwide basis. And this is based on data that the USDA publishes. The Foreign Agricultural Services publishes this about once a month. And they've updated, obviously, the data for the 2015 crop year, but also put some projections out there for the 2016 crop year. And if you look at it, we were talking about these slides, this chart in particular, all winter, Mike, and it really looked like we had a burdensome supply increase relative to where we were back, say, in 2012. 2012, right. The stocks-to-use ratio for soybeans was 21%, and corn it was about 15%. Right. And we saw a big increase in both of those. If you look at it, what's taken place since then, and they've revised the 15 numbers, the 15 estimates, and now put out projections for 16, and it's a change, right? Yeah, it's a big change. Right. That's right. Much tighter supply-demand situation on a worldwide basis, especially in the soybean market. That's correct. Than what we were thinking back in the winter. Yeah. Yeah. Also a tightening in the corn market. Now the number change there isn't huge, but probably what's maybe most significant is the trend, right? Both of those showing a tightening of stocks-to-use ratios worldwide. And obviously the markets are very concerned about that.
Yeah, and so let's kind of think about even kind of what's driving that underneath that. And basically what it appears to be is that we are worried about, and the markets are suggesting concerns about our supplies being weather impacted in terms of pulling back. It's not because we've got this rapid ramp up of demand that has resulted in this stocks-to-use ratio going in this direction. It's because we're getting concerns about what's happening on the supply side of the market. And in fact, that just is dominating all, and the weather side of that. That's just driving all the conversation today. And so we need to understand the fundamental drivers here are really kind of what's going on in the fundamental supply and demand environment. And it's mainly a supply problem right now, and concerns about supply is driven by weather.
So we've got a supply problem overseas, especially in South America, which has been the discussion much of the winter, late winter and early spring time frame. That's one driver. The other driver underneath this is concerns about possible weather impacts or even climate impacts on crop production in the U.S. this summer. So far, those look to be unsubstantiated, but there's a lot of concern about what could happen this summer in August and July, and the impacts on both corn and soybean yields. And from our perspective, we're seeing a weather premium built into these markets right now.
That's right. That's right. Yep.
So you mentioned supply as the driver as opposed to demand. And as I think about commodity markets over time, when we see supply-driven bull markets, There's an old saying in the commodity markets about those kind of markets having a sharp run-up early
Right.
and a long tail.
A long tail. That's right.
The implication is that this might be creating a marketing opportunity for us.
Yep.
And I say might be. Obviously, we don't know definitively.
That's right.
But it is a big change for us. So let's take a look at the prices here. And we debated this morning when we were talking about this webinar, getting ready. We chose to use longer-term charts, even though they're based on yesterday's prices. We wanted you to think about prices from a long-term perspective. So what we've done in this chart, this is cash corn price projections for Central Illinois based on yesterday's closing or settlement prices for the respective futures contracts that we've got listed on the horizontal axis. So we took July 16 futures, December 16 futures, December 17 and December 18 corn futures prices, adjusted them for a basis estimate to get some idea as to what the futures market was suggesting cash corn prices might be, not only here in 2016, but looking ahead the next couple of years.
Yeah, and so just to make sure that they know that we try to keep up with things, I just checked about 10 minutes before we went on air, and so we're up another 5 cents on corn and about 30 cents on beans today. And so we have a tendency to think about, that 16 number there, December 16 number, and saying, okay, how much upside movement potential is that? But an interesting thing on this chart, and it shows up on the soybean chart as well, is look where those 17 and 18 prices are. And if you think strategically, you can't ignore the short-term opportunity. But the question is the issues associated. What about long-term as well? Particularly when we're thinking strategically about investment decisions and financial positions and those types of things, which is going to be a major focal point of what we're going to be doing in our upcoming August session. So, should we be doing some pricing now, Jim? What do you think?
Well, that's a good question. And the holdback for most of us with respect to pricing in this kind of environment is there's a tendency to want to wait and see what happens tomorrow, right?
Right, yeah, that's right.
We were talking about that just before this webinar got started. So one of the challenges, and your concern obviously, is that there might be some additional upside potential.
Right.
And it's human nature to be concerned about missing out on an opportunity.
Right.
So one of the things that we would encourage you to think about is in fact doing some forward pricing at these levels or close to it.
Yeah, I mean Michael, we're on beans particularly, but certainly on corn, we're really darn close to black ink again, right?
Yes, we're getting closer, but certainly this 4 to 420 band is still not high enough for us not to expect some further adjustments to cash rents and land values. And that's the point I wanted to make. That's a point that probably some people are thinking in the back of their mind. Does this mean that cash rents are probably not going to come down some more as we look into the future? From my calculations, we're still not quite high enough with corn prices to see no adjustments continuing. And so that's another thing I've been thinking about is this a high enough adjustment for March that we're going to see a situation that's different for cash rents and land values? Yes, but I think we still got some downward pressure on both cash rents and land values. We'll talk a little bit more about how this changes liquidity for the Case Farm here in a couple slides, but it certainly changes substantially how we think about liquidity moving into the end of 2016 compared to where we were in March.
So Jim, back to your issue. Okay, we're saying ought to think seriously about doing some pricing, take advantage of this run up here, and kind of get some things locked in. How do I mitigate the fact that it's going to run away on me, and I just don't want to lock in at those lower prices and have that $7 corn that I know has the potential to happen. I've got it all locked in at 4.5. What do I do? How do I do that?
Well, the strategy that I would look at, and I think exactly how you choose to execute this is going to vary across farms, but if you're going to do some pricing at these levels and you're concerned that we could see some additional upside that you might miss out on, the strategy that I would encourage you to look at or think about is purchasing out of the money call options.
Yeah, okay.
Basically buying an insurance policy against further increases in those prices, whether it be corn or beans, and probably deciding how much you're willing to pay for insurance up front, and then look at the premiums and use that as a basis for deciding how far out of the money that call option needs to be. You know, obviously, I'm not going to argue that they're cheap. They're not. It'd be a significant investment. But the way you could back that up is say, I'm willing to give up some of the upside potential in return for a lower premium, and that's where different people are going to reach different decisions about how much they're willing to pay for insurance versus how much upside potential they want to retain. So I think of the 16 farm families that are watching this webinar today, I think different people are going to reach different decisions about how to execute that strategy, but that would be the basic idea to protect yourself. You know, if you're hedging in the futures, that would give you some protection against future margin calls. If you're doing cash price contracting, that gives you some protection on the price side as well. So
if we want to think, though, make sure we think, again, not just in terms of, okay, what should we do now? And, you know, it's really important to keep a strategic perspective in mind as well. So if we kind of look at what's happening in 17, 18, at least the markets are suggesting is that this maybe isn't necessarily a permanent new environment that we're in where we're back up into a new space. Is that correct?
That's right. And if you look at it, we were talking about this again this morning, the price projections for 17 and 18 aren't too far away from the long run price projections that, for example, the Food and Agricultural Policy Research Institute was publishing over the course of the winter. They had been suggesting, and I think some of the other long-term forecasters were suggesting, we would see corn prices approach $4, maybe a little bit lower than what we're showing on the screen at the moment, but not a lot. And similar with respect to soybeans. In fact, let's take a look at the soybean price chart.
Yeah, look at soybeans. Actually, it shows that it isn't even flat. It's there's at least the markets are suggesting that, okay, we may have a weather event now, but this thing has the potential to soften on into the future unless we get something really, really dramatic happen on the demand side or a more permanent supply shock, right?
That's exactly right. And if you look at it, the markets are suggesting that as you look out in the out years, you really ought to be managing your farm in a way that is consistent with prices ranging maybe between $9 and $9.50. Right. If you want to be a little more optimistic, maybe between $9 and $10. Right. And that's not so far away from what we were talking about this winter. There was a period of time when we looked too optimistic with some of the charts we were using. At the moment, maybe we look a little not quite optimistic enough, perhaps. Yeah. And that's the volatility that we often experience in the commodity markets. But it does look like an opportunity to do some forward pricing, think about how you might protect yourself against margin calls. I guess one point we should make is with respect to crop insurance. I know one of the concerns people have with respect to cash contracting is yield risk. And for many of the people watching this webinar, I suspect a lot of you bought crop insurance that had a pretty high coverage level, in fact, probably 80 and 85% for a lot of the people watching this webinar. So you've got some coverage there. You still have some risk exposure. I don't want to minimize that completely, but it does change things quite a bit versus a much lower coverage level with your crop insurance program.
A couple other points about this chart. Mike was asking about break-evens earlier for corn, and we're a little south of break-evens right now, at least for a lot of people. Particularly as you move towards average productivity ground, break-evens a little higher than the current corn prices that we had in the previous chart. But soybeans is a different animal. For particularly people on above average productivity ground, $11 is probably close to their break even, if not a little bit above their break even. However, as we move into 17 and 18, then we're moving into red ink again. So one of the things I also wanted to comment, when you're thinking about long-term strategies in terms of producing corn and soybeans and kind of the mix of those two, soybeans have looked awful good here this spring, and we're seeing they look good back March relative to corn, and now it's even better. That could change as we move into 17 and 18. If you look at these two charts, the corn chart that we previously showed you, and then this soybean chart, we could see a switch. We could see corn looking a little bit more attractive than soybeans as we move into 17.
So if you kind of think about this whole issue, we're going to actually try to come back to this then in the August session and talk not so much about short-term pricing risk and those types of things, but this whole issue of how you think about both from an economic and a decision-making context, but also just to the points you were making. How do you protect yourself from this regret issue that you have if you do some pricing today and find that the market continues to go up? I mean, one of the issues we always worry about, well, I can't do that because I'll regret that I lost all that money left on the table type of thing. How do you mentally think about those issues and make smart decisions, both operationally as well as strategically, in terms of managing the uncertainty we have? And, let's don't forget that there is an upside, but there's also a downside. And we ought to make sure we don't ignore the downside, but we ought to capture the upside when it's there, particularly if we think the upside maybe is fleeting.
Well, that's true. And then I think the other thing to mention is, which we didn't mention it earlier, but is one to consider. For most of us, we're still looking at pricing a small portion of our crop.
That's right.
And that means we have a majority of the crop remaining, and so from that standpoint, additional increases in price are actually a good thing because it is raising our the value that we would be using, for example, in our inventories. So that's important to keep in mind. But I know for a lot of people that's very challenging, and that's why I suggest the strategy that involves the use of some options, and perhaps just think about what you can afford to pay or want to pay for that insurance. So let's move on. So that we wanted to talk a little bit about that at the outset because we thought it was so important, and because the change has been so dramatic over the last really 3 months, I guess, since we had that webinar in March. In fact, let's go back and look. Michael, take a look at the case farm, and this is the data based that we were using for the March webinar. And I'm going to let you walk through that.
This is the data we were using for the case farm in March, as Jim indicated, and boy, have things changed. Back at that time, we were looking at $3.50 corn. Of course, this is adjusted. Futures price was adjusted for basis, and $8.50 soybeans. And then the trend yields for Central Illinois were also used there. We were using a band of negative 10% to plus 10%, and I'll show you what the financials look like with that band and given these prices. But I can summarize it pretty quick here, Mike, and things look grim. In that particular band with those base prices, things look pretty tough. Even if you didn't buy any assets later this year, you were looking at some trouble repaying operating debt. And so this run-up in prices has really opened up some opportunities, perhaps, of thinking a little bit differently of asset purchases, particularly later this year.
And so you've done now an update of this with the more current numbers, although you didn't put in the 5-cent increase that we just got today or whatever type of thing. So where are we at right now? And then you're going to actually do some show the financial metrics as a result of this.
Yeah, let's go to the next slide here. This is the next slide. Sorry, Jim. They look so similar. So now, this was earlier this week, I plugged in some prices using some future prices. We have $3.95 corn. It's actually a little higher than that now. It's closer to $4.10. And $10.65 soybeans. Now it's closer to $11. And I'll talk a little bit about that when I talk about the financials. But I also use that band of negative 10% and plus 10%. One of the things I want to say before I continue here is, given how much things changed, was it a waste of time to do this back in March? My answer, of course, is no, and a very strong no. We need to know where we're at a given time so we can plan. Obviously, our plans have changed, but that's the whole point. Back in March, we were looking at some really digging in and really worried about making loan payments and not worrying at all about asset purchases, whether that be machinery or land. Now things have changed. Our worries are a little bit different. Our plans a little bit different. But I think you get the point. We have to plan for given the situation that we're in at a given time. And as things change, it becomes even more important to update these pro forma income statement and really think about how we're going to protect our liquidity or what we're going to use our liquidity for.
And we're going to show you some numbers here in just a second, Michael, but I just want to reemphasize something here that's really important. When you've got an uncertain environment, notice what Michael is doing, and if you look at the next slide, you'll see the results of it. And that's this question of we've got to think in terms of scenarios. Single valued expectations, which is the way most of us historically have done. And this isn't farmers, this is the business world generally. They put together budgets. They put together budgets that say, okay, this is what we expect to happen. This is our projected income. This is our projected expenses. Here's where we project to be. that when you get the kind of uncertainty we got, you can't operate that way. You got to know what the upside potential is and the downside risk. You got to think in a, and that's one of the things that we're going to continue to reinforce again in this session we're going to do in August, is the importance of scenario analysis as a way to understand what my opportunities are, as well as what my risks are in this uncertain
And you know, Mike, I think it's really important to think about on the slide we've got -10 to +10.
Yeah.
When we were doing this back in March, there was so much negativity floating around. There was a temptation to think about the base case and the -10 only.
Right, right.
What happened the last 2 months? It illustrated the value of having that +10% scenario out there.
Even though we blew past that +10%.
Yeah, we did.
Corn
We
and
did.
soybeans both increased more than 10%.
Yeah.
So and quite a bit more in case of soybeans.
Let's take a look at the numbers.
This was the numbers in the March webinar. I don't want to dwell on these too much because they're rather depressing. But just to illustrate that as things change, we need to update our projections. And back in March with the 350 corn, we were looking at a base case with a rather large negative net farm income. A negative profit margin, working capital was deteriorating even for the base case. It took at least a 10% higher price not to have working capital deteriorate. And look at the term debt to coverage ratio. Again, this ratio looks at our ability to make principal payments with long-term debt. And you can see until we got up to that 10% higher, we were not able to do so. And this was without buying any assets. Just a reminder on this case farm. This case farm typically buys $500,000 to $600,000 worth of machinery every year. So it needs to make that investment year after year. It can be lumpy, of course, but it needs to make that investment year after year just to replace the machinery that's wearing out. And so these numbers without buying any machinery, and things were very tight.
Yeah, and so if you kind of look at that base case, even those numbers, that term debt coverage ratio, just again to remind you as participants, something less than 1 here makes a lender pretty nervous, right?
Very nervous.
And it ought to make you as a farmer nervous, because that means your conversation with your lender is not going to be what you would like. He's going to be asking questions, and you've got to be able to kind of think about how you're going to buffer yourself from income for being able to make those payments if you've got that kind of a term debt coverage ratio.
And also, maybe this is obvious, but if it's below 1, you have to seriously think about whether you should buy any machinery.
That's right.
That's right. You have to really need that machine.
That's
in
right.
other words, the benefits have to be pretty high compared
That's
to
right.
the cost in order to buy that machine, because you really can't afford it
Yep.
if
Yep.
the ratio is below 1.
Yep.
So let's move on to a little bit more rosy scenario here. This is the current information. Now the base case, again, we sent this, I updated this a couple days ago, and so things have changed a little bit, and I'll talk about that. But for the base case, now we're looking at a $560,000 net farm income, a swing of $700,000.
Yep.
And so you can see, you get farms of a fairly large scale. It doesn't take a real large change in corn price and soybean price, and you're looking at a substantially different situation. We're looking at a profit margin of about 11%. That's still below our long run benchmark over a long period of time for this farm is over 20%, and we achieved that. I'll show a chart on that, but we achieved that pretty much from 2007 to 2013, and so we're still quite a bit lower than that, but it's still a lot better, -2% all the way up to 11% with this run up in corn prices and soybean prices. Probably just as importantly, notice what's happening to working capital here. Working capital, even with the 10% lower prices in the base case, we're looking at an increase in working capital if we don't buy any machinery at the end of the year. And so working capital looks like it's pretty solid, and also the term debt coverage ratio looks pretty solid. In fact, in the base case, and we'll talk more about this in the August session, for the base case for this farm, it could buy that $500,000 to $600,000 worth of machinery this fall.
Now it's in a position
It can
to be
afford
able to
it.
do that.
Now, whether that's a smart thing to do, that's something we'll address in the August session. There's a lot of opportunities for that liquidity in addition to replacing machinery, and we'll talk about those. But at least now it has the wherewithal to do that if it wanted to.
Yeah. So just let me kind of leverage back to that in a second. I mean, as you think about where we're headed in the August session, and that's part of what we want to do in this, is kind of get you thinking about where we're going to go. We had on the agenda, we have on the agenda to talk about growth, right? We were going to talk about risk and growth and succession planning and those types of things. We'll talk about the agenda here in a second. But what's interesting is I think our mental perspective and maybe the industry's perspective back in March was, okay, the real focus here is going to be risk protecting the downside, right? We're going to talk about growth, but we're going to be talking about it in terms of that's something that may be out there in the future. You always need to worry about how you're going to grow your business, right? But that's probably not top of mind right now. That's not what we're going to have. There's not going to be a whole lot of people.
The emphasis was on protecting working capital.
That's exactly
primarily.
right. Boy, I'll tell you now, that growth discussion, to Michael's point, maybe is going to be an opportunity that we can spend a little more time thinking about in this situation. But let's make sure that we don't believe that necessarily that this is a given that, okay, our financial problems are all history, right? You still have to worry about the downside.
Exactly.
Still have to worry.
And
about
that's why I
downside.
have the range here, the different scenarios, the negative 10% all the way up to a plus 10%. You could argue that maybe the range needs to be a little wider given the uncertainty we have in prices. Perhaps it should. You could easily do that using the spreadsheet that we sent you. But look at the negative 10%. You know, I've been fairly rosy here and talking about this slide. We get back to that. If we take off 10% of corn and soybean prices again, which could happen if we had a big crop in the U.S. If we take off 10% again, we're getting closer to not being able to buy assets this fall, and so we need to update these types of figures as we move through the season for our planning later this year. On the other hand, at above 10%. We're going to be adding quite a bit of liquidity to the farm. We can really look at some different options. In terms of expansion, buying machinery for expansion, buying machinery just to replace what's wearing out. We're going to have a lot of different options, I think, if you're looking at that plus 10%. By the way, given the prices that Mike was talking about earlier, today's prices, we're probably closer to that 5% higher scenario. So we're probably looking at right now. You know, who knows what prices are going to do? I don't. Maybe you two guys do.
But Jim does. That's your
right
job.
now, using the projections that we've been working with here, we're looking at a profit margin of about 15% and net farm income about $800,000.
And I guess to keep it in perspective, when you were doing your analysis, Michael, you were using the prices that you outlined earlier as the assumption behind, for example, the price that you were valuing those inventories at the end of the year. So if you think about how we typically market, that's another way of saying it. It implies that you could lock in all of that inventory and production at those price levels. Which
these are all projections. That's a very important point.
All right, so let's take a look at the next slide.
Now to put this in perspective. Yes, things have improved mightily. We're not looking at a negative profit margin under the current prices, though that could happen if prices drop quite a bit. I always have this on one hand, things look good, on the other hand, they don't look so good. So that's just my personality. But if you use the base case scenario, we're looking at a similar profit margin for this farm that we had in 2006, 2014, and 2015. If prices would improve even more, even if they would go up another 10%, you're still not looking at a profit margin that would approach what we saw from 2010 to 2013. So what this slide does, it just puts it in perspective. Yes, things are much better than they were, but we're still not that much different from where we were in 2014 and 2015. Now, one of the reasons for that, remember, part of our income for 2016 has already been decided. We sold some old crop, corn and soybeans. We didn't get a real high price for that if we sold it in the first quarter. And so that's built into these projections. It's important to keep that in mind.
All right, let's talk a little bit about our business plan template. And that's really something that we're going to focus on here. Late June, early July, we're going to be shipping a new template, right? So you want to walk through that a little bit, Michael?
These parts of the business plan template are very similar to the one we had in the notebooks in March. We're just trying to simplify things here a little bit to make it a little bit more manageable. And so the components here are very similar. We are going to have you focus on the current position and vision, mission statement, and goals when we send this to you in early July. We'd like you to start filling out some of those things. The current position is just going to be a few questions, so it's not going to be too hard to do. What are my major enterprises? What are the resources that I have available to me? Start thinking about what resources do I need as I think about growth. And so those would be fairly simple questions to ask and to answer, and you usually can do that more of in a list form. The vision, mission statement, and goals, we're not going to have you, unless you want to, develop a full-fledged vision statement necessarily, but we do think it's important to think about some key words that would be in your vision and mission statement. So if you're a family business and that's very important to you, put that in your vision statement. Right. If you're really worried about sustainability, soil health, things like this, put that in your vision and mission statement. Right. So you kind of get the idea there. I think that's just as important as having a full-fledged vision statement as you think about what's important to this business and what are some key things that we need to think about as we move forward and try to bring family members into this business.
Yeah, and I think in some cases we try initially to be too precise and have it a nice piece of prose that we could that we could quote or whatever. What I think is the best way to go about this, Michael, is exactly what you said, is that just to have here's the 4 key bullet points that are really the phrases that we want to try to capture. We can eventually convert those phrases into some kind of prose statement if we want to. But here's the elements that we really need to think about.
Yeah. And then one of the things I'm going to push pretty hard here, Mike, if you don't do it before you come to the session, we'll return to this in the August session, is to really think about a couple long-term goals related to financial ratios and growth. I think it's extremely important in the size of forum that you guys are managing out there, that you really think about what is our target profit margin, realizing that you're not going to be able to make that target every single year. Right. 2016 is still going to be a challenging year for the case farm. It's still below what its target of 20%. But to come up with a target and then to come up with a way to measure whether you're falling short of that target over time. And so I think that's very important, but also with growth. Right. I think if you're going to grow, you need to think about that in very specific terms. I would actually quantify that. Yes. We're going to add X many acres per year. We're going to try to grow X% per year, and then track over time whether you're achieving that goal. And quite frankly, if you don't do that, it's going to be more difficult to bring in family members. Because you have to plan way ahead. If you've got a young family member and you want to bring them to the business, you obviously have to plan way ahead, and you have to think about how we're going to grow to make sure that person at least has the option of joining the farm. If they decide not to do that, so be it.
And just to kind of leverage that conversation a bit, one of the things we're going to really spend some time in the August session talking about is how do we really think about growth? Not only the strategy and to Michael's point, the whole question of having goals, having expectations. But we're also going to actually kind of think about this question of how do you really measure growth? Yes. And in the business, we have a tendency in agriculture to think about growth in the context of adding resources. Yeah. Well, in a way. In the vernacular, to use a phrase, really ought to get better before you get bigger, right? And getting better means more gross sales. And so maybe, Michael, I don't want to add any more acres. Yes. What I really want to do is figure out how to get better yields, productivity out of my current resource base. And I do that. In fact, we'll talk about kind of the phase 1, phase 2 growth cycle. And that's phase 1 growth cycle is intensify what I'm doing now, do it better and get more gross revenue and under cost control, get more profit out of my current resource base before I actually start thinking about, do I add more acres? Do I get more units in my hog operation? We have a tendency in farming to think about growth. Growth means I need to get more resources. Really what I need to do first is get better at doing whatever I'm doing so that I am really best in class in what I'm doing and have not just an operating profit margin, Michael, that's average, but is in that top, 20%?
Yeah, definitely the top quartile, and the 20% profit margin is in the top quartile,
Yeah,
and so that's
yeah.
why I kind of use that. But yeah, if we're sitting at 10, 12%, someplace like that over a long period of time, let's say the last 10 years, we better get better
That's right.
before we even think about growing, because we got a problem.
Yep.
We better call Houston. We've got a problem.
Yeah.
We've got to make some adjustments there, because that's just not going to cut it.
Right.
We're not going to be able to generate enough money to pay for the assets that we're purchasing.
Yep.
And so it's also about getting better at the things that are repeatable.
That's right.
That you can get better at and be better at year after year.
Exactly.
One reason we tend to focus in some of the workshops we do and some of these programs on cost management and cost control is because we have a lot of evidence that over long periods of time, firms that are low-cost operations are very repeatable.
Right.
If they're low cost in 2016, they're probably going to be low cost in 2017, 2018, 2019, and so on.
Right.
And that's the kind of change that you want to implement that actually helps you grow over long periods of time.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Okay.
So Michael, here we've already done a little bit. We've done it's a fair amount of work. We're going to capture it though more systematically in our new template in terms of this strategic analysis.
Yes, a lot of the forms that we worked on in the February session were related to strategic analysis, and so that part's fairly complete.
Right.
If you
right.
need to work a little bit more on some of those forms, if you didn't complete them, you'll have the opportunity to do so. But please try to do that before the August session. But that's fairly complete, and so we're going to focus on that execution and implementation. I'll let Mike talk a little bit about that, and then business and management succession. So let's talk a little bit about the execution and implementation, Mike.
Yeah, so what we're going to do in much more detail, we kind of teased this up at the very end of the session in March, or the last session we had. What we're going to do here is really do a deeper dive in terms of those areas in which you have to make strategic decision choices in terms of growth being one of them. We've got to make decisions there in terms of a marketing strategy, not just marketing decisions, but here's our direction that we're trying to go in terms of marketing, both in terms of buying as well as selling the marketing strategy. So we're going to lay out a number of those in more detail and try to be more systematic about how we actually go through that process. And we've got some things that we are hoping also to kind of have you think about in terms of how do I just do a better job of not just implementing my strategy, but implementing in terms of the operational side of my business. I mean, how do I use standard operating procedures in my business? And there's some issues associated with staffing. How do we typically end up hiring people? Well, we expanded, we got a bigger operation. Gee, we need to hire somebody. Well, what do they need to do? We need to figure out. Some people suggest that to the growth issue specifically, you actually need to staff before you expand. You need to be able to, because what you really don't want is you don't want to have made a major commitment, bought some assets or and then find out that you don't have you're all working 24/7 now rather than, you haven't got yourself well positioned to be able to operate this expanded business.
And
we have a
unfortunately,
tendency to get that backwards in many small businesses.
Unfortunately, we tend to get that backwards in farming quite often.
That's right.
You talk
That's
to people, they'll say, well, I have 50% more machinery than I need because I'm going to bring a son in and I need to have that machinery to farm additional acres.
Right.
Well, they don't think necessarily about, do I need additional people?
Yeah.
And if I do, maybe I should bring them on board, get them trained.
That's
and so
right.
when we have this larger operation, we're ready to run.
Yeah,
we're ready to roll. And we don't have to do a lot of training on the job, if you will, when we don't have time to do the training. So
and
very
we're
good point.
going to also, Michael, there talk about this business and management succession. So we're going to get into the weeds on the legal stuff and all that kind of stuff. I think, do you have a law degree? Is that right? Is that
No,
correct?
I do not.
Oh, we're not going to get in the weeds on the legal side. Is that right?
Yes, we're going to focus more on transitioning management. I think for you guys that's going to be a very relevant topic. How do you transition management from from the older generation to the younger generation? We've got some ins and outs, some ideas related to that, and so that'll be one of our main areas of focus there. We'll also have at least one checklist you can go through, just talking about what are some things I need to think about in terms of business and management succession, and where am I at with respect to those things. You've probably seen those on the internet before, but we'll try to pull out at least one of those checklists so you can kind of monitor where you're at, in addition to talking a little bit about this management transfer.
So in each of these areas, and they've already done, to your point, they've already done first phase financial projections. We're going to revisit that,
Yes.
right? That's what the world is all about
Yes,
when
we've
you
done
have
pro
changes.
We've done pro forma, and I'll talk a little bit about how you would go about maybe doing a pro forma balance sheet.
Right.
That's not real easy
Right.
to do,
Right.
but once you have the pro forma income statement, you're a long ways down the road of having the pro forma balance sheet. And so I'll talk a little bit about that in the August session too, because one of the things we want to make sure that you understand is clearly how to analyze your current financials. We spent a lot of time on that in the February session. You guys spent a lot of time looking at your current financials, but we want to get you in this mode, if you're not already, of having a good set of financial projections. Not just a corn budget and a soybean budget. You probably do that already for individual farms even. Maybe at a very micro level. But in addition to that, having some a pro forma or projections for an income statement and balance sheet.
Right.
I think that's just so important if we're thinking about planning, particularly related to growth.
Yep. So let's just make sure we don't give the wrong message here. Are we expecting them when they're done to have a 78-page business plan and all of this in nice gory detail and all that kind of stuff? That's not what we're...
It won't be 70 pages, but it could be 15 to 20 pages
That's right.
of questions that have been answered and worksheets.
Yeah, and to that point, our expectation is that this is not something you do once and then we're done for the next 3 years. These are reviewed regularly, right? And what we're trying to do is set this up in a way so that, in fact, they can capture their thinking process, right? Because a lot of farmers in this room have a lot of this up here, right? Now, sometimes they have it up here and the other farming partners have something else up here, right? And so they don't quite communicate back and forth. This gets it all so we can kind of hash it out, think about it, figure out whether we're all on the same page, right? And it also then provides us the vehicle so in any planning activity, what you do, you revisit and revise. And this allows us to remember the assumptions we made when we were making the original plan. And therefore, when we revise, we can say, okay, that assumption, the world changed. That assumption maybe now has to be modified and altered so that we now can have some opportunity to grow or not grow, or have some opportunity to make some decisions about transfers of property or whatever our succession plan is, et cetera. So it's all about trying to kind of get a little bit more systematic about our thinking process, but capturing it in a way so that we don't forget or haven't communicated to other stakeholders in the business what we're planning to do or expect to do, including our lender, including other family members, et cetera. So that's the whole idea, not to overwhelm with, this has got to be fancy stuff. It's really, really, as you mentioned, 15 to 20 pages, handwritten in many cases, right? We're not saying it has to, but it's a way to capture what's up here, because we really do have a tendency to forget a lot of stuff.
Now, in this plan, of course, we're focusing on the farm, but many of you have non-farm businesses too. That would be a separate plan.
Right.
But you'd certainly want to do that. That's just as important for a non-farm business. But Mike and I have worked with a lot of non-farm businesses with business plans,
Yep.
and so you could use this for the non-farm business too. But also, Mike, if we're thinking about going into an alliance with somebody,
Absolutely.
some other farm or some other agribusiness. This is a good tool to have.
Right.
Think about this business plan and think about all the ins and outs of how that might impact your current operation.
Right. Yeah. In fact, you mentioned that it is kind of an interesting phenomenon, because we just reviewed a plan of a company that is actually farmers that are thinking about taking fairly sizable farming operations and figuring out what they could do together that might make them better, more efficient, more effective, as well as facilitate the transition that they're looking for, where you've got in one part of this farming operation or one of these units, you don't have any family members that want to take it over, but they got some key employees that they want to transition in, right? Mm-hmm. So they're thinking about structuring it. They've got to structure an operating company so that they can make the transition, maybe holding the land out as a separate entity so that they aren't actually transferring land assets outside a family environment, but trying to kind of integrate. So, what they have done is they've got a written document that basically says this is kind of what we're trying to get accomplished, and that allows them to have a much better conversation between all of the people in both entities to figure out whether a strategic alliance or a joint venture or whatever kind of arrangement might make sense. And we see increasingly, and these are both pretty sizable operations that you would think, well, they're standalone, they ought not to be having to think about seriously. Well, they think there's real opportunity for doing a few more things together than they're doing. It's kind of like the small two-person co-op idea, right? I mean, that's what cooperatives historically were all about. We can work better as a team than we can individually where it comes buying inputs, selling, same type of thing here.
And so I want to talk also about the interaction between the financials and strategy. Some people maybe some people like to crunch numbers. I personally like to crunch numbers. You guys know that.
Right?
I spend a lot of time working on spreadsheets and really enjoyed putting the case farm together for this particular set of webinars and workshops. But the strategies are also important. A lot of times you need to think about the strategies before you can even do the financials.
Right.
How can you do the financials if you haven't thought about what you're going to do and why you're going to do it?
Right.
But at the same token, you can't just think about what you're going to do and why you're doing this without the financials. And so they both work hand in hand. And fortunately, you guys have a decent set of current financials. You're a lot further along than most people.
Right.
Most people are struggling to get that current set of financials together, and so this is very difficult. But because you have that, it makes it a lot easier.
That's right.
To think about the strategies and think about where you're heading from where you're currently at.
Right.
So you can probably tell because my laptop is sitting on my lap. We have a question from a viewer, and it's really very timely. It fits right in with the discussion that we've been having. And so I'll just read it. It says, how do you get the next generation to work as hard and as dedicated as you do? And the second part of the question is, with a large diversified operation, how does the next generation get a handle on the whole operation? And I'll kick this off by saying, I think the first issue is to maybe take those two and flip it around.
Yes.
So one of the strategies, one of my responses would be, with a large diversified operation, or even a maybe not so diversified operation, get that individual, that next generation, involved in that operation, and not just the mechanics, not just the physical labor side of the operation, but bring them into the discussion we're having. And this whole strategic plan, business plan discussion, you bring those folks into that discussion, and now you've set the stage. And I'll share a story, and I know, Mike, you've probably got some better ones, or maybe many more. A few years ago, I had a student who came from a farming operation, relatively large, successful operation, but the student was working for me part-time in the department. And as he approached graduation, we started having discussions about what he was going to do when he graduated. And I kind of assumed he was going to become a part of this family farming operation. And one of the things he pointed out to me was that in his family, they'd never had any of these kinds of discussions. They never talked about where the business was going. He had never been exposed to even though he was a finance minor at the time, he'd never had the opportunity to be exposed to his family's financials. So as a result, he didn't feel like he was even remotely a part of this business. He felt very much like he was simply spare labor that was available during key periods of the year. And as a result, from a career standpoint, he didn't think there was an opportunity for him to go home. When in reality, when I looked at it, at least on the surface, it appeared like there was a potential opportunity, but it was a little bit like two ships passing in the night. I think the family probably assumed he was just going to come home automatically, and his perspective was, what's there to come home to? I'm really not part of this, right? So I think that fits right in with our discussion here, Mike. And I know you've been in this situation with working with a lot of farm families over the years.
So back to the business plan slide just a second. I mean, that is to your point, this has the potential in response to the question. This is the potential for actually having a vehicle for having that conversation.
Exactly.
It's a way to have it, because what happens to us is we have family meetings. We get together on a regular basis, right? Or we get together every week. Well, most of those conversations are operational conversations. They are not about where are we headed in the next 2 or 3 years. They're about how do we get the work done this week, right? Very important to have. So this doesn't replace the operational type of activity. But if you have something like this, and again, let's don't overemphasize it's got to be fancy and, you know, color slides or color, pictures and that kind of stuff. But if you have some document like this, and you will hear, and it's not just because we're professors, it's because we actually have had experience with people. If you don't write it down, you have a tendency to not recall it very well, right? And that is not just a function of age, okay? I'm sorry, it's just not a function of age. It happens with everybody at whatever age they are. And so this is the vehicle whereby you can have that conversation between the experienced person in the business and the younger generation and say, okay, this is at least our perspective. I mean, and you jointly develop it, but sometimes you have to start with somebody putting something down on paper, saying, I'll take first cut at the draft. In this experience I just was discussing earlier, we got these two entities thinking about merging. What they did is they let the younger generation take a first cut draft of this. He thinks that this is something we ought to do. The senior member said, well, by gosh, let's see his proposal. Okay? Don't just talk about it. Come up with some proposal, right? And so he drafted, not as a complete proposal of this is what we ought to do, but this is for conversation and discussion purposes, right? It wasn't a big 20-page, 30-page report. It was a 2-pager saying, here's what I think we ought to do. Here's why I think we ought to do it. Let's have a conversation about it. It's the way that we have conversations about this and eventually then get to having not only a decision made, but in this case, we're integrating that younger generation into the operation in terms of the thinking process, the strategic decision-making process.
Right there.
Right.
And it's not just about, what level of nitrogen are we going to use on this particular farm with respect to corn in 2016. It's about these bigger issues. And when you have those discussions, now you've communicated to the next generation that they are, in fact, an integral part of the team, an integral part of the management team, making decisions about the future. Another farm that we've had a chance to work with over the last several years, Michael, I'm thinking of, is one that has focused and getting back to the vision and mission and their goals. One of their goals very clearly in that family's operation is they want to create career opportunities for family members.
Exactly.
Not just labor, they want to create career opportunities for well-trained individuals, people that go to college, come back to the farm, or farming operation or agricultural operation, and they're expanding in multiple ways, right? Multiple enterprises, looking at all kinds of opportunities. But it's very clear from a long-term standpoint, they've got 3 generations involved in an operation today, and they're looking at ways to bring in the 4th generation, right? And they're all having those discussions, and it's clear that that's what's motivating growth in that farm. It's a desire to provide career opportunities for family members, and they keep expanding with that goal in mind.
Yeah, and when you're doing that, both the older generation, the younger generation, or there's 3 generations involved, need to think about how does the younger generation fit in. All the generations need to think about that. The older generation needs to think about what are the skills that this younger generation family member has that he's going to really add or contribute to the business. But that younger family member also needs to be pressed on that. And a lot of families that I've dealt with, both farm and non-farm, basically ask the younger generation to answer a very basic question. How do you fit into this operation, and what are you going to add to the operation? I know they're family members, but if you're going to bring a family member in, that better be answered affirmatively.
That's right.
That they're adding something. They've got some skills that are currently not in the business, and they're adding something that's really going to enable us to expand down the road. One of the reasons I like talking about the transfers of management or the management transfers is I've seen so many family and friends back in Nebraska struggle with this. And I don't think this is just a Nebraska phenomenon, though we struggle with some things back in Nebraska perhaps because it's a little different climate there. But nevertheless, I've seen so many people struggle with this that makes me want to to talk to people about this. And we'll talk more about this in the August session, but when a younger generation, a family member comes in, and we talked a little bit about this earlier, we need to give him some responsibility.
Right.
Whether that responsibility is due to a function,
Right.
finance, for example, or
Right.
bookkeeping or marketing, something like that. It's related to an enterprise.
Right.
It's related to a farm, something that they're responsible for and are making some of the decisions, talking to other people, of course, that they're responsible for, so they get some ownership in the business. The trick is to not have too much responsibility too quick.
Right.
Because even though they might be smart, maybe they went to Purdue and got perfect grades, whatever the case may be, or the University of Illinois and got good grades, they may be smart and very skilled in a certain area. You can't go from no responsibility to complete responsibility, and so it's gradual. Give them some responsibility, see how they respond to that, and gradually over time increase the level of responsibility.
And doing that does
It sounds simple. It's not, but that's a key thought I wanted to throw out.
but it does also mean giving them enough responsibility that they can occasionally make a mistake.
Yes.
And the key issue there is to make sure that there is a learning process associated with that, right? And to not have the perspective that mistakes are failures or mistakes are things that, sure, mistakes may result in something happen that you don't want to have happen. How you convert it into value is make sure that you learn from that. We learn something about this process. We learn something about the decision. We learn that we need to make the decision in a different way. And that takes what might be perceived by some people to be failures to actually be successes, because we got dinged financially on this, right? But by gosh, we learned enough that we're going to actually be able to get better financial performance, if that's our metric, because we learned something from this one that we aren't going to repeat, or we're going to learn how to do it better the next time.
And you just want to make sure that those mistakes, if they happen, are not catastrophic.
That's right. That's right.
They're manageable mistakes.
That's right.
We've got a couple minutes left, Michael. Did you want to bring up the spreadsheet very quickly and give a little overview?
I think the spreadsheet is self-explanatory, Jim. We talked about some of the output from the spreadsheet, and so just like I said in the March webinar, if someone has a question related to the spreadsheet, by all means send that to me, and we could talk about that more one-on-one. We can also talk about the August session.
Yeah, so let's look at the August session here a second. Any other questions before we proceed ahead?
We do have a question.
Okay,
just
great.
came in. Thinking again about the next generation and young people, what fields of study should a young person pursue in the next 5 to 10 years? And this individual says, I'm thinking it's probably not agronomy or production areas. Would human resources be an area that somebody should pursue? And so that's a good question. Michael, I'm going to let you start,
Okay,
and we can all add in.
I have a viewpoint on this.
I knew you did, so that's why I started there.
And it doesn't surprise you, and you probably get some similar types of response from the three of us in this context. One of the things that we think it's really important for people to understand is we're thinking about skill sets is first to think about and have an attitude about learning and lifelong learning. So it's not necessarily what should I study, it's how do I approach the whole process of thinking about how to get better and developing the skills, the capacities, the motivation, and the interest in saying, you know what I want to do? I want to continue and improve until I decide to retire. And maybe even then, I'm going to continue to figure out how to do new things differently, right? So it's a lifelong learning mentality, not just, oh, I got my education now, I'm going to go to work type of thing. We need to encourage that kind of mental frame of mind. Secondly, in my educational process, what should I focus on? You focus on things that have what we sometimes call a long shelf life. Things that are fundamentals that are going to be there not just next year, but fundamentals are going to be out there 20 years from now. Now, in the technical area, that's why you need to really understand biology very well, because biological production processes are going to be there for a long period of time, whether it be in animal science, whether it be in agronomy. The fundamental concepts associated with mechanical processes are going to be there. They have a long shelf life. What does not have a long shelf life is the current latest fertilizer, seed, chemical. That stuff is going to change. You have to understand something about the growth process and the agronomic basis for growth, right? Or the animal nutrition concepts. But in terms of what's the latest and best technology, that's going to change profoundly. So you don't spend all of your time there. You learn how to manage a business. Doesn't surprise you. You learn the concepts associated with how you think strategically. You learn the concepts about how do you do a better job of actually managing people, because managing people is going to be, and it's not just, okay, I don't have any employees. How do you manage your own time? How do you become more systematic in the decision processes that you're going to make, rather than making decisions without a systematic way of going about it? Those have long shelf lives. You learn how to do those things, and that'll be something you use over your entire career. And those are the types of things we focus on.
So we're getting a little short on time, so I'm going to wrap this up, and I'm just going to add really one thing to what Mike said, and it kind of fits in with the lifelong learning concept. If you want to work in agriculture, I would encourage you to major in agriculture, and I'm not going to get specific about which field within agriculture, because we've got a wide variety of things that you major in. But one of the reasons I'm going to suggest that's important is because of the value of networking. Mm-hmm. One of the things that happens, and I guess all of us have experienced this at this stage of our careers, is when you come to campus, you get to know a lot of people that are going to spend their career working in agriculture. And later on, that can be very valuable.
Absolutely.
Those contacts and maintaining those contacts through a variety of professional development opportunities can be absolutely invaluable. You'll get to know people that are working in a variety of agribusinesses later in life. Right. You'll get to know people that are working in a variety of national, for example, and state level commodity organizations. Mm-hmm. Maintaining those contacts and a professional development setting going forward can be very, very valuable. Right. And really help you master the skill set you need. I agree with the question. You know, some things like human resources that, for example, when I was a student, and perhaps when you guys were students as well, wasn't something we focused on. Right. Those opportunities exist with regardless of which major you choose. Right. That's a function of picking up some coursework here and there, and you can do that. Right. So it is important to identify some of those potential needs. Exactly. But the value of networking with people throughout your industry, I think, is extraordinarily valuable.
Absolutely.
So with that, I think we're going to wrap it up because our time is up according to my clock. Mm-hmm. So we need to move on. We are looking forward to seeing all of you again in August here in West Lafayette. We will be shipping to you, I think probably the first week of July, looking at our calendars, an updated template to help you make some progress with respect to your business plan before you come to campus in August. Our goal at the end of that session, remember, is to have you walk out of there with a completed business plan. And so working on that a little bit during the month of July and perhaps during the first couple weeks of August will be extremely helpful. And that updated template, we think, will just be a little easier for you to work with. That's the goal of providing the updated template. And then if you have a question that pops up after the webinar today, maybe something we didn't address, or you're having a little challenge with the spreadsheet, or maybe a question about the business plan template once you receive it and you're working on it during the month of July, do not hesitate to send us an email. And mine's probably the easiest to get a hold of, but you could send emails to any of us. If you send it to me and if it's really addressed to Michael or Mike, I'll obviously forward that on and we'll respond pretty promptly. So with that.
And let me just emphasize in this session, just one final comment here. One of the things that we really are going to have them do in this session is this is going to be less listening and more work.
More doing.
Right? So we're going to build the time into this activity so that, now I don't want you to say, well, I get a chance to do all of this business planning stuff, so I'm not going to be able to do any of this before I show up there in August. No, don't go there. But what we're saying is that in the spirits you just mentioned, we want them to walk out of here with most of the root elements of this business plan. And so we're going to give you time in these sessions. We're going to develop some concepts. We're going to review some of the things we talked about, develop some additional concepts, but it's going to be work activity. They're going to do a lot more discussing, than listening to what you or I or anybody has to say.
Great. So with that, thanks for joining us today. Thanks again to First Farm Credit for sponsoring not only today's session, but this entire series of workshops. And we'll look forward to seeing you in August in West Lafayette. Thank you.